Hello friends and welcome to our next Laravel API video. In the previous videos we covered creating our Laravel API, and in this video we want to start with the front-end application and use our API. So we will start with React.js, and in the future videos we will have an example with Vue.js. So make sure you have this project open on your machine because we need to serve this application on the local development server so we can make API calls. Also, we want to make a few tiny changes along the way to our API. First, let's start by creating our React application, and for that I'm going to use Vite. So you need to have Node installed on your machine so we can run npm commands, and in my terminal I want to say npm create Vite at latest. So this will prompt me for the name of the project, and I want to call it Laravel API React. Then we can choose the framework, so of course we want to use React.js and vanilla JavaScript for the variant, so we will not use TypeScript. Then we want to cd into that project and install the dependencies. Now, while that is running, I want to also install Tailwind CSS for our styles. So let's go to their website, which is linked in the description. Then you want to go to Framework Guides and then Vite. And up here, React is selected by default. And we just want to copy these commands and paste it in our terminal. And one last package I want to install, and that is React Router DOM. So let's say npm I React Router DOM. Alright, when that is done, we can open this in VS Code. So I have my React project on this window and then our API on the other one, so we can start building our front-end application. Let's start by configuring Tailwind CSS. So we need to add these directories to our Tailwind config.js, and it has to go inside this array of content. It is basically saying that these documents may contain Tailwind classes, so watch those documents. But we don't have TypeScript, so we can delete this TS and TSX. Next, we want to include Tailwind directives. So if you take a look at your source folder, we have two CSS files. We don't need both of them. You can delete one and keep the other. So I will delete index.css, and then in our app.css I'm going to delete everything and use Tailwind directives. Now I want to use my own custom classes that we've been using for almost every video, and you can get those classes from my YouTube GitHub repo, and just down here I have Tailwind classes that I regularly update. So we just want to copy everything from here and paste it in our app.css. So this is just a custom font and some CSS classes for different elements. And of course, it includes the Tailwind directives up here. So we don't have to worry about anything. We can close this one. Now let's clean up our application before we get started. Inside our app.jsx, we want to delete all the imports except our app.css. Then we want to delete these variables. And then within the markup, I can delete everything here and just add a text hello, so we have something on the screen. Also, I don't like to export my components like this. So we are declaring it up here and then we are exporting it down here. Since we have only one function in each document, I prefer to export it as I'm defining it. So I can cut this statement and paste it up here, and this way I don't have to repeat myself somewhere else. So that is our app component. Next, we want to go to main.jsx and delete this import for index.css, which it doesn't exist anymore. Also, I don't want to use the strict mode, so I can delete that and also this import. Now, inside the assets folder, we can delete this React, or we can just delete the whole assets folder altogether, since we will not have any assets. And with that, we are ready to start creating our React app. Before that, I would like to show you the extensions that I'm using for my JavaScript development. So if I just search installed here, you can see I have ESLint, that is from Microsoft, and then these two other extensions that are also from Microsoft, and I believe these three will be installed by default when you install VS Code. So you probably have these already. Next, I have JavaScript ES6 code snippets, and then if we move on from all the Laravel extensions, I also have npm IntelliSense that would help us with the imports. And then we want to move down to Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. So this is obviously for Tailwind CSS classes, and it will give us an autocomplete. We also have these two extensions that belong to Vue.js. They are not related to this video. Anyway, let's start building our app. The first thing I want to do is to set up Vite for our API calls, because normally we want to use the fetch API and then the URL to our API project. So let me show you what I mean. You don't have to code this. I just want to show you what we need to do. First thing, make sure that your Laravel API server is running, and you can do so by going to your API project and just run PHP artisan serve. So this will give us a URL that we can copy and go back to our React app. So we want to fetch some data from this URL and then /API and then some other route, for example, posts or user or register and so on. And we also need to include some headers. Remember, when we were creating our API, we always had to include that accept property in our headers. So I don't want to keep repeating these headers on every page. So I can include all of this in vite config. So therefore, we will keep our code to minimum whenever we want to make an API call. So I'm just going to copy this URL and then delete this whole thing. Let's open our vite config file, and under plugins, we want to configure our server. So we can use the server property. Within that, we want to use the proxy property, and then we want to use a key here, and by convention, it's API. And then again, this is an object. So this is where we include our API information. So the target for this is our URL. So we usually include it like this without the / at the end. And whenever we want to make a call, we would just say /API and post for user and so on. Then we want to set the change origin to true. And also we can include the default headers here and set it to an object, and then set the accept property to application JSON. And I can also include the content type in here, since we are going to send requests, and the content type of those requests must be application JSON. So we can include it here. Therefore, we don't have to repeat ourselves on every API call. So that's in terms of configuring vite for our API calls. So in our app component, we want to create our router. Let's just start by importing a few things from React Router DOM. So we need the browser router, and then routes, and then a route. So make sure it is all imported from React Router DOM. And down here, we want to return first a browser router. Then within that, we want to have route. And then again, within that, we will have a route. Now this route will be the wrapper for all the other routes. And this is where we would define our layout, basically the navigation. For this route, we can set the path to /, that is our homepage, and the element that is going to render, we would call it layout, and we will create it in a moment. Now let's have one route within this layout, so we have something on the screen. Again, we want to use the route. This time I'm going to self-close it like this. For the element, we want to have a home page, and the path is going to be the same, because when we go to the home page, we want to see this element with our navigation. So we can call this index. So that means this route path is the same as the wrapper or the parent. So let's start creating these components. In the source folder, I'm going to create a new folder and call it pages. Within that, we will have layout.jsx and also home.jsx. Then in our home component, I can just say export default function home, and let's just return something simple. So I will have an h1 that says latest posts. So this is our home component, and next we want to create the layout. So let's just copy everything here and paste it in the layout and just change the name up here. So first we want to have our header. Within that, we will have our navigation. Then we would use links from React Router to create our nav links. So we can say link with a capital L, and this needs to be imported from React Router DOM. Then we can call it home or whatever we want. Then set the to attribute that would go to /, and I'm going to add a class navlink. So this is included in that CSS file already. Then after this header, we will have our main tag that would include whatever child component that we define inside this wrapper. So we need a placeholder here, and for that we can use outlet, which is part of React Router DOM. And this is our layout. So let's import these two documents or components in our app.jsx, and I believe if we retype it, VS Code will automatically import that for us. Let's do the same thing for the home component, and we should be ready to test our app. Let's go back to the terminal, and in your React application, we want to run npm run dev. So this will give us a new URL that we can use it in our browser. So if we open this one in a browser, we have our navigation up here and also that text latest posts. So I just want to add class title to that h1 on the home page, so it looks much nicer. Alright, so for this video, we want to cover authentication, And in the next video, we will cover the CRUD actions of our API application. And we are going to start with register. So let's close everything. And then inside the pages folder, I will have another folder and call it Auth. Within that, we will have a register component and also a login component, login.jsx. Then let's grab everything from home and just paste it inside login. Just change the name to login as well as the title. So for example, login to your account. Then we want to do the same thing for the register and just change the name and the title. All right, so we have the components. Next, we want to go to our layout and create links for them. So under the home link, I can create a div, and within that, we want to have the links for login and register. So I can copy the link and say, go to /register, change the text, same thing for the login, and we have our links up here. So I also want to add a class to this div wrapper, so we have a space between these two links. And we can use the space X and maybe number 4. This will add some space to the first element, but not to the next one. So we have margin left on login, but we don't have it on the register. So this is our links. Next, we want to create the routes for these components. Let's open our app.jsx, and we just want to repeat the same process. Let's copy one of these routes and paste it 2 times. We want to set the path for register to /register, of course, and the component we called register. So again, make sure it is imported. Same thing for login. We want to set the path to /login and the component login. Now you notice here sometimes VS Code doesn't want to help us with the imports, and I honestly don't know why this happens every now and then, but we can just do it manually. All right, so we should be able to visit these pages. Let's go to login. We see the title and now register. Next, we want to create our registration form. So on the register document, we can have a form, and we don't need the action, of course. And then within that, we will have a div that will contain an input field of type text. We can set the placeholder to name, and we just want to repeat this for email, password, and password confirmation. And remember, these are the fields that our user model expects. So for the second one, we can say email, and I will leave the type as text because I want to see the error messages from our backend application. Then for the third and the fourth one, we want to set the type to password. And for the placeholder, we can say password and confirm password. We also need a button with the class primary btn and the text that should say register. Then on the form tag itself, I'm going to add some classes. So set the width to half and mx auto so it is centered, and also a space y. So that means margin bottom, maybe 6. So this is our form, and now we have to get the values out of this form using React. So I'm assuming you are familiar with React, and if you are not, I recommend watching the React Basics and React Hooks videos, which is linked in the description. So let's create our form data state. So we can say const form data and then set form data, and then we want to use the use a state hook from React. It is imported up here, and for the initial value, we want to pass an object with the properties for our user model. So we want a name and set it to an empty string. Then I can just copy paste this a few times and change the properties to email, password, and then password confirmation. Then we also need a function to handle the submit. So let's create a function, and let's call it handle register. We need to accept the event, so we can prevent the default by saying event prevent default, and let's just log the form data to the console. All right, so we have our form data object and also the submit handler. So let's attach this to our form. On the form tag itself, we can use the onSubmit listener and then use our function that we defined up here. Then for each input field, we want to set the value to the property in our form data. So we can say form data, then name for the name input field, and then we want to listen for the changes on this input field. So on this listener, we can pass an anonymous function and accept the event because we want to listen for the changes, and then use our set form data function, so that is from up here, to update the value of that name. Now, this is an object, right? And we want to spread whatever value we have already and then change the name. We want to set the name to event target value. So this is just saying keep the email as it is or the password as it is. Don't worry about any of that, but change the name to whatever we type in the input field. Now we just want to repeat these 2 statements for all the other input fields. So let's copy it, paste it here for the email, and just change the property name to email. Same thing for the password. and we just want to change the property name to password, and lastly for confirm password like this. Now we should be able to test this out. Let's go back to our project and open the console, and I'm going to provide some text here so we can see it in the console. Press register, we get name, email, and so on. Next step is to submit this to our API. So we are going to use a simple fetch statement with async and await keywords. So in our submit function, let's say const response and set it to fetch and the endpoint for our API, and that is /API and then register. Few things here before we move on. You notice we are able to call our endpoint just by adding this string because we already set the base URL in our Vite config. Next, we want to make our function async because fetch API returns a promise and we want to wait for that response. Also, fetch by default will perform a GET request, but this endpoint is expecting a POST request with the values in the body of our request. So we can add the options and first set the method to post and then the body to our form data. Now we need to convert this from an object to a JSON format. So we can use JSON stringify that is looking for an object. So we can just pass down our form data here. Now you notice we are not including the headers because we already defined those in our Vite config. So let's continue. We want our JSON response, so we can create a data property or variable and set it to response.json that will again give us a promise. So we want to wait for that result, and after we are done, we just want to log that to the console. So let's see what we get from our API endpoint. If I reload the page and press register as it is, you notice we are getting an object that has the property message and another property that is errors, and that errors object or property has our input fields within it and the respective error, which is inside an array. So we can use this errors object to show these messages to the users. Let's create a state for our errors first. We can say const errors and then set errors, and of course set it to user state. And initially we want to make this an empty object. And then we want to check if the data has the errors property and then update this error state. Otherwise, do something else. So right after we get the data, we can use an if-else statement and check if data errors was true, then use our set errors function to update our errors. So we want to set the errors to data.errors. So as we saw here, this errors is an object, and that's exactly what we want for our errors state. Now, if there was no error, we will just log the result into the console. And keep in mind, we can also check for the response OK property. So this response up here will give us a property that is called OK. So for example, I can say or response OK was true, or I can negate it and say not true. So with this OK property, we can just check if the response was OK or not. But I like to check for a specific property in my response. So you can include that in your if statement if you want to. Okay, so now we have the errors. We just want to show them to the user. So under each input field, we can use the curly brackets to check first if there is an error. So we can say if errors title was true, then using the logical operator, we can render a p tag with the class error and then the content that should be errors.title. I'm sorry, this title should be name. I am thinking of a post model, but this is the user model. We call that name, and that is our key. Now remember, the values of these properties are inside an array. So we want the first element of this array. So we can pass brackets after the property and then number 0. That means the first element. If we go back to our website, reload the page and press register, you can see we have the error message for the name input field. And we are not getting anything into the console because the response was not okay. All right, so we want to copy this line and paste it for the email. And again, just change the properties also for the password. So we don't need to include this for password confirmation because technically password and confirmation password are the same. All right, so back to our project, you can see we have error messages for all the fields. And in fact, we can check other messages as well. So if I include the name here and an email that is not correct and the password that doesn't match and press register, we get the email field must be valid, and also password fields do not match. So we are properly getting the error messages, and if we include the right information, we should have a proper user in our database. But before doing that, I want to go back to the terminal and to the API folder. Our server is running, so I'm going to open a new tab here. It's still in the API folder, and I'm going to run PHP artisan migrate fresh because I want to delete all the data that is already in our database and start fresh. So let's press enter. If we open our database, we don't have any users or posts or anything. Let's go back to our website and register a user. So I'm going to use this information and the password and press register. You notice we get an object here that has the token and the user instance. But you also notice we are still on the same page and see the same values and nothing really happened. So we will fix this in a moment. But we also need to save this token in our local storage so that our application can use it even if we reload the page. Because if we save it into a state, when we reload the page, that state will be gone. So if you go to our application tab and under storage, we have local storage and then our domain. And this is where we want to create a key value pair to accept that token or save that token. We could also save other information if you wanted to, but I want to grab the user information from our database rather than from the local storage because that is in the browser and the security of that is very, very low. All right, so let's fix the problems we have. First, we want to navigate to the home page when the user is registered. So we can use the use navigate hook from React Router. Let's create a variable for it that is actually a function and set it to use navigate from React Router DOM. So now this navigate is a function that we can use. So down here, we can say if the response was successful and the user was registered, we can navigate to the home page just by adding the path inside this parentheses. We also want to save the token inside the local storage. So we can use local storage set item that is looking for the key. So let's call it token and the value. The value we want to use is data.token. So remember, so this data is an object with two properties. One is user and the other one is token, and we want the token. So now when all of this is done, we want to update our navigation that shows the user is logged in. So we need a user state or a global state for our user. And for that, we are going to use React contexts. So again, if you are not familiar with context hooks or other React hooks, I have separate videos for each React hook, and the link of that is in the description. Anyway, let's continue. In the source folder, I'm going to create a new folder for our contexts. So let's just call it contexts. Then within that, we will have a document, and I like to call it app contexts. So I like to have one context for the whole application instead of separate ones. Now, the first thing we need to do here is to create our contexts. So let's just say const app contexts, so the name of the document, and we want to set it to create contexts from React. So this function will give us a component and a provider that allows us to expose whatever data we want to the rest of the application or to the children of this component. Now we want to use this in other components, so I'm going to export it like this. So later on, we can grab this in any component. Next, we want to create a custom component that would wrap our whole application. And let's just create it first and you'll see how it works. So I want to have an export default function and I want to call it app provider. So this is the component that will provide the information for the rest of the application. And we want to return our app context component. So in here, we can say app contexts, then provider. So this provider allows us to provide certain values to the children of this component. And in order to do that, we can use the value property. Now we can pass anything here, but by convention, it is usually an object. So we can use another curly brackets within the curly brackets. For now, let's just have a name and set it to John. So we are just hard coding this to see how it works. Now, as I mentioned, we want to have other components here. So we need a placeholder similar to what we did in the layout. So we use the outlet, but in our provider, we want to have a different approach. And in React, we have a special prop that is called children. So we need to accept this up here in our function that is our prop and then pass it down here. This is just a placeholder similar to outlet from React Router. And we are saying we are expecting other components or elements within this provider component. So let's see how we can use this. We want to wrap the whole application with this provider, right? And if we go to our main.jsx, this component, which is our app, that is our whole application. So we can wrap this with our context provider. So I'm just going to add a few lines here, and then I can import our app provider component. So you notice it is imported up here for me from app.context.jsx, and we are using this function. So we just want to wrap our app with this provider. That's all. And we can close main.jsx. So for now, everything is happening inside this function, right? We are creating a simple component, and then we are accepting the children as a prop. Now, our component is a provider. That means we can have properties or values or variables exposed to the children of this provider. And we said our app is the children, so that means the whole application. And we are exposing this name that is set to John. Let's go back to our website, and I'm going to bring up the console. So I already have React DevTools installed, and if you don't, you can install it from Extensions Store, and I believe it is available on all the Chromium-based browsers. You don't have to use this, but I just want to show you what we get. You notice we get our component tree on the left side, and it starts with our app provider. So this is the one we created up here, and it is at the very top because we wrapped the whole application with it. Now, that app provider has a context provider under that. So the second child is the context provider. So that is this app context provider. And then we have our app. Now you noticed here, before we go to the app, you notice we have this value that is set to name John. So that is coming from here. So that means all these components that are inheriting from our context can access that value just by calling the contexts. So now let's see how we can access that value name that is sitting in our provider. So this is where our app context comes in, and we are exporting it, right? So let's go to the home page just as an example, and we want to grab the name, and this is in an object. So we can destructure that, say we want the name, and we want to grab it from our context. For that, we can use the use context hook from React that would look for a context. We want to use our app context here. You notice it is imported up here. So this app context is the one we are creating up here. So not the component, but the context itself. So now we have access to the name, and I can just maybe output it down here. If we go back to the home page, we can see that text on the screen. So that is how we can access the global states from any component. We just have to use the use context hook and then pass down the contexts we want to use. So this was an example. Let's delete everything and continue with the registration. So back to our context or provider, we want to have different variables for tokens and the user. Now we could have this in an object, or we can do it separately. This is your preference. But what I like to do is to have a token and then set token, and we want to set this to use a state from React. Now the initial value of this token, we can set it to the local storage token. So let's say local storage get item, and the key here is token. So if that exists, we will get the token. If it doesn't, it's just going to be null. So now we have this token and set token variables. We can expose them to the whole application by passing it down here. We can just say token and set token. So now we want to update this token state whenever the user registers. So let's go back to register component, and after the local storage, we want to use that set token. But first we need to import it. Just like what we did in the home page, we want to destructure that set token that is coming from use contexts and then our app contexts. So make sure all of these are imported from respective directories. So now we have access to that function. Let's go down here and set the token to data.token. So just to make sure this is working properly, I'm going to comment out this navigate for a moment because I want to stay on the register page. And at the very top, maybe under this H1, I'm going to output that token. Now we need to destructure it from our context again. So make sure we are grabbing it up here and then in our markup displaying it on the screen. So if we go to the register page, we don't see any token, but let's register another user. So I will use this new user and press register. You notice now we have the token on the screen, and we can see the immediate changes because it is coming from our state. And of course, if we take a look at application tab in the DevTools, we have a token key that is set to this user's token. If we go back to our database, you can see we have 2 users, and under personal access tokens, we have 2 tokens, 1 for each user. So this is working properly the way we want. So I'm going to delete these and bring back this navigate, because we want to navigate to the home page and we don't need this token up here. Now the next step is to update our navigation based on the authentication state of a user. And as I mentioned, I want to call our database to get the proper user using this token. We could, of course, set the user to true or get their ID or name as they register. But then again, that would be in our state and also in the local storage, which is in the front-end application. And it might be fine for a simple thing like changing the navigation look. But later on in our application, we want to check if a user is authorized to do certain actions. So not only authenticated, but also authorized. So that's why I want to grab the authenticated user and check that with my database. So basically, I want to have another state in our contexts. So let's create another state here, and I'm going to call it user and set user. Then we want to use the use state hook and set this to an empty object. Next, I want to create an async function because we will call our API. I will call this get user. So first, we want to create our response and wait for the fetch API to give us a response from API user. Remember, this is the route that would give us the authenticated user. If we go back to our API routes in our Laravel application, this is the path we want to use. And you remember we said this is protected with auth sanctum. That means this is looking for a token. Otherwise, we would get an unauthenticated error. So we want to include the headers for this request, even though it's get, and have the authorization key here. For now, I'm just going to add an empty string to see what we get. Then we want to grab the JSON data. So we can say await response JSON, and then let's just log this into the console. All right, so this is our async function. Now we need to call it somewhere. So what I like to do is to call this whenever the token is updated. And for that, we can use the use effect. So this would be called first when the application loads because it is in our contexts. Then I also want to call it whenever the token is updated. So this use effect hook from React that is imported up here is looking for a callback function as the first argument and an array of dependency as the second argument. Now, if we pass an empty array, basically we are saying just run this once when the application mounts. But if we pass a state here, for example, the token state, we are saying run this command every time the token state changes. And just to show you how it works, I'm going to log something to the console and just say effect ran. All right, so all of these are happening inside our app contexts. Let's go back to the application and open console. You can see we already have that log, but if we reload the page, you notice we get it one time. Now, the token is not being updated at the moment, but if we register a user, that means we are updating that token state. We should see another output. So I'm going to register again with another user and watch what happens down here as soon as I press register. So we get our user object, but we also get this effect ran one more time because the token state was updated. Now, instead of this console.log, I want to run the getUser function, but I don't want to run this and waste an API call if the token doesn't exist. So I can simply check that before using that command. So I can say, if the token is true, then get the user. Otherwise, there is no use calling that getUser function. So again, let's go back to our website. The token does exist, and that's why we are getting the message unauthenticated that is coming from up here. And if we reload the page, we get the same message because now the token is being filled from the local storage. If we delete this manually and then reload the page, you notice we don't get anything because this is not being called at all. So now we don't have a token. We just want to register a new user. And again, I'm going to use another username and press register. Now we are back to that unauthenticated message. That means this function was called because the token state was changed, and then this whole function was called. So all we have to do here is to provide the proper token when we are requesting the user. So we can use backticks here because we want to include this token. And then inside this backticks, we can say bearer. That is how we can include the authorization key. And then there's a space here. Make sure you have that space. And then $, curly brackets, and token. This should give us the proper user. So back to our website, you can see we already have this Steve user in the console. Now, of course, we want to update this user state. Let's just say set user to data. So I'm going to delete this log, and then down here, we want to expose that user to the rest of the application. I don't think we would need the set user. That's why I don't pass it down here. But if we do need it in the future, we can simply add it to this object. So now we have a user state available to the whole application, and it is coming from our application. So later on, we can check for authorization as well. But for now, we just want to update our navigation. Let's go to our layout, and first we want to grab our user state. So let's say const user, and we will set it to use contacts and then our app contacts. Then we want to make this section conditional. So I can add curly brackets here and say, if user was true, then have a block of code, for example, with user name. Otherwise, we want to have this other div which includes login and register. So I can move these curly brackets down here and format my code. So again, we are checking if the user is true. We want to see the username, and we don't see this part. But if it's not true, we will see login and register. So let's go back to our application. You can see this name up here. If I highlight it, it's easier to see. I will style it in a moment, but it is working properly. So now let's style this very quickly. I just want to have a p tag here with some classes, and we are just saying welcome back username. So now we see that text, welcome back Steve. And later on, we will add the logout functionality to this section. Since we are here, I'm just going to add this class to this div because we will have more elements here. Anyways, that is our register, and we are able to authenticate the user and then update our navigation. But at the moment, I can still go to register page, even though I am logged in. I am not supposed to go there. So we can solve this problem the same way we did in our layout. So let's go to our app.jsx, and we want to grab the user state in this component as well. So let's say user, and again, use contacts and then app contacts. So now we have access to user, and we want to check if that is true, then render homepage, for example, otherwise register. So down here, I can say if user was true, give me home, otherwise render register. And then I'm going to copy this section and paste it for login as well. So now we are on the home page and we are logged in. If we go to login, you can see I am back to the home page, even though the URL still says login, and there is actually a proper approach to this rather than just a ternary operator, and that is by creating custom auth components or guest components. So we covered this in my Marin stack videos, and if you like to have the component for that, you can use this code from the GitHub repo. But basically, we need to create a different component, and we can call it whatever we want, then output different components based on the state of a user. But for this simple example, I think this is fine what we have here. So let's cover the login functionality now. And we've already covered a lot, so the rest is going to be easier. We just have to repeat few actions. So I'm going to copy everything from register, then open our login component and paste everything here. So let's go through this and change things around. First, let's change the name to login. We do need our set token. We do need the navigate hook. We need the form data, but we don't need name or password confirmation. So I can delete those two. We do need the errors and the handler that I'm going to change the name to handle login. Then we want to make a request to our login endpoint instead of register. So let's change this one. The method is post, the body is the same, and we want to wait for the response, and we check if there is an error. We will add it to our errors state. Otherwise, we will set a token key in our local storage and also update our token state in our app contacts, and then navigate to the home page. And I don't want to log to the console anything. I'm going to delete that from the register page too. So let's continue. In the markup, we want to say login to your account. The handler is called handle login. Then for the input field, we don't need a name. We do need an email and password, but we can delete password confirmation. For the text of the button, we can say login. We should be able to test this out. So back to our website, let's delete this token manually because we cannot go to login if that exists. And if we reload the page, we can still see the text and not our register and login because I made a mistake here and set the initial state of our user in our app context to an empty object. Instead, we can set it to null. Therefore, when we check for the user and we say if the user is null, that means it's true. So we can see register and log in. So just make sure you change the user initial state from an empty object to null. Right, so let's go back to our login page. And in our handle login function, I'm going to comment out this navigate because I want to stay on the page. Also, I want to log the data into the console because I want to show you something that needs to be changed. Let's go to login page. If we press login without any information, we get the proper error messages. If we add an email, for example, this John3 that doesn't exist in our database, we get the email is invalid. So this is also correct. But if we add an email that does exist, but the password is incorrect and press login, you notice we get this provided credentials are incorrect, but the key is message. And in our UI, we are not seeing the proper error message. So that's because the way we set up our API. And if I change this back to an incorrect email again, you can see the structure of a response we get. So it's an object with the key message, and also there is another key that is called error, and that error is an object with the properties and the message which is in an array. And in our login page, we are checking if the data errors is correct. When the email does exist, but the password is incorrect, this fails and we fall into the else statement. And in fact, if we check our application tab, you can see we have a token, but the value is undefined. So we add something to the local storage, but it was just undefined. And to fix that, we can go to our Auth controller in our API app, and right here where we are returning a message, we can change this to match the structure of default Laravel error messages. So for that, we need to have errors as the first key. Then I'm going to cut this string, add another array, and then provide the key email because I want to see the error under the email field, and then set this to yet another array. And within that array, we will have our text. So you can see we have 3 arrays and 2 keys. All right, so this is the change we need to make in our Auth controller inside the login function in our API app. So let's go back to the login page. And if I provide a correct email, but wrong password and press login, this time we get the proper error message that says provided credentials are incorrect. So now we can go through the proper login function. So I can delete this log. And now let's reload the page and start over. So we want to go to login, add an email and password. So if it's not correct, we can see the credentials are correct. But if I add a correct password, we are back to the home page. We can see the navigation is updated. So we can see welcome back, John. And in our application tab, we have the proper token. So if this token is wrong, so I'm going to manipulate it down here and reload the page, you can see we are getting an error in the console, but also in the navigation, we only see the text welcome back. And again, and that's because the way I set up this get user function. So we can also check this before setting the user. We can say if the response was okay, then set the user to data. Otherwise, it will remain null. So now our navigation is fixed again, and we have login and register because the token, even though it exists in our application local storage, but it's not correct. If I change it back to a valid token and reload the page, we can see welcome back, John. All right, so our register and login is done. The last thing we want to cover for this video is the logout functionality. And you notice I'm jumping back and forth between these functions and I'm adding things or adjusting things. That is how we usually code. And even if you have everything planned, you might still make some mistakes or forget few things. All I want to say, don't get discouraged if you have a bunch of errors in your code. You just have to go back and forth and debug your code. Anyway, let's continue and go to our layout to apply that logout functionality. So for this, we want to have a form because we want to make an API call. So we want to submit that form to the logout endpoint. So in our layout component and where we have the username, we can create a form, delete the action, and within that, we just want a button that says logout, and we want to have the class nav link for this button so it would look the same as all the other links. Now, when we submit, we want to have our own function, and I want to call it handle logout. So now let's create this function up here. And of course, it needs to be async because we want to call our API. Again, let's accept the event so we can prevent the default. And then we want to do the same thing with login and register. So we want to create our response, use the fetch API, and we want to go to /API, then logout, and then provide the headers, because remember, we protected this route with auth sanctum. That means it is looking for a user token. So similar to what we did in our app context when we get the user. Now we need the authorization key, which is saved in the token, and that is exposed to the application. So up here, we already have the user. We can also grab the token simply by adding there. Then in our fetch function, we can include the headers and the authorization key, set it to backticks, then bearer, a space, and that token. So then we will get the response JSON. And again, this is a promise, so we need to wait for it. And let's log the data into the console. But if that is successful, we want to reset our token and the user state, and also delete the token from the local storage and navigate the user back to the homepage. Because if they are on a page that is only available for authenticated users, we want to return them back to the homepage. So first, let's grab the navigate from navigate hook. Let's say navigate, use navigate from React router. And then again, we can check if the response was okay. Then we want to update the user and the token state. Again, we need to grab set user and set token. So let me make sure that I am exposing those functions. So let's go back to app contexts. We have these set token and set user here, but down here, I don't have the set user function. So make sure we are exposing all those variables to the rest of application. All right, so now back to our layout. We want to say if the response was okay, set the user to null, set the token to null as well, and remove the token from local storage. So we can say local storage remove item and pass the key here that is token. Because if we don't remove the token from local storage, if they reload the page, then set token will be filled, then the set user, so the user will be logged in again. Then when everything is done, we want to navigate to the home page. All right, so this should work. Let's see. If we reload the page, so all the errors are gone, we have the username and the logout. Let me just fix the styles here. So on this wrapper, I just want to add flex items center. So now it looks nicer. All right, so we know we are logged in. We can see the name. We also have the token here. And if I press logout, we get an error that says the get method is not supported. Sorry about that, because this is a post method. I'm sure you saw it, and I keep forgetting things. So we just want to set the method here to post. Okay, let's try this one more time. I'm going to reload the page. We have the token in the local storage, and let's press logout. The token is gone. We are back to the home page, and the navigation is also back for a guest user. Now let's log in again. I'm going to use another user, then press login. We are back to the home page. We can see the username. We have the token, and everything works the way we want. So we are done with our authentication system and this video. In the next one, we will cover the CRUD actions of our application. So we will create posts, list posts, update, and delete one. So thank you all for your support, and I will see you at the next one.